Who composed the famous quartet in the Nazi prisoner of war camp? Well, today I want to tell you about a French composer by the name of Olivier Messiaen. Olivier was born in 1908 in Avignon, France, and his father, Pierre, was a scholar, and he would translate Shakespeare into French. And his mother was a poet, and she really loved looking into like the mysticism and working that way. And so he was completely saturated in this deep cultural, deep artistic, and very expressive household. He was encouraged to use his imagination, and by the time he was only 7, he was already composing, and not just like simple little tunes, but vivid and expressive music. It was inspired by fairy tales, by religion, and by color. When he was just 11, he entered the prestigious Paris Conservatory, and there he studied organ and harmony and composition as well. Rather than follow traditional harmonic rules, he began inventing his own system, what he would later call modes of limited transportation, and these modes created shimmering, static harmonies and that felt suspended in time, like stained glass that is glowing in sunlight. And he could break these rules because, as I've told my students, once you know the rules, then you can think about breaking them. One of the fascinating facts about Olivier is that he had synesthesia, and this is where you see colors, shapes in sound. So you hear something and you're going to see different colors. So when he was composing, he often said he would like to make a whole rainbow. And another interesting fact is that he believed that birds were the greatest musicians in all of Earth. So he became an avid ornithologist. We've had a few composers that did this, and he would travel all around with his notebook in hand, trying to find different birds and listening and learning how they sang. In fact, he loved birds so much that he has compositions that are built entirely around the sound of the birds singing. Then in 1940, the war was going on around them, and he joined the French military. He was a soldier, but he wasn't really on the front lines. He was a medical assistant, you could say. But in 1940, the French invaded, and they captured him and a bunch of other people. And so he was imprisoned, put in a prison of war camp. While in the camp, he met some other musicians, and a sympathetic prison guard gave him some paper and a pencil, and he started composing a piece, a quartet, with the instruments that they kind of had. And there he wrote Quatuor pour la fin du temps, which means quartet for the end of time. And there in the prison camp, it premiered in 1941 for the other inmates and for the guards in the rain, played on the battered instruments that they were able to find. This piece represents eternity and time suspended, but also hope. If you listen to it, to me, it feels like there's a foundation that's just missing, and I think that's the whole idea. Like there's just no way to quite get your ground under your feet. Olivier was a devout Roman Catholic, and it's really difficult to talk about his music and not talk about that because for him, that influenced everything that he did. And a lot of his music, to him, he wrote it as a prayer. Years before the war, he married violinist Claire, and they had a son, but tragically, her mental health really went down, and the marriage ended up being dissolved. Years later, he married one of his very good students that he fell in love with by the name of Yvonne, and she began playing his stuff. She really was like the interpreter of his music. And so they weren't just married and like life partners, but they also became artistic partners. There is a French cellist, and he invented one of the very first electronic instruments. And Olivier was absolutely fascinated with this instrument. It is called an onde marteneau, and it sounds very eerie and like ethereal and a little bit alien-like too. Anyway, Olivier used this in his composition. So he's one of the earliest composers that we have that formally introduced electronic music into his compositions. But he wanted more. He had so much he wanted to express. So now we have more instruments. But he went and looked beyond the Western music. And he looked into Indian music and really learned about Indian rhythmic cycles and the Balinese gamelan music. And he incorporated all that into one cohesive piece that he would do. All these influences helped him create rhythmic structures that felt timeless and complex and deeply spiritual, very far removed from the European standard meter at the time. Years later, in the 1970s, he comes to America and he visits the Southwest, and very particular Bryce Canyon National Park. And he was absolutely overwhelmed with his vastness and the colors and the silence. And this experience completely inspired him. He wrote this monumental work blending nature, geology, birdsong, and this cosmic wonder. He created such amazing, beautiful music out of this experience that years later, in Utah, a mountain was actually named after him. Now, long after he graduated, he went back to the Paris Conservatory and he became a teacher, teaching composers. And he even taught Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, which we've talked about, but he taught many people, has such an influence, as educators do. His ideas really helped shape this modern and avant-garde music that we started hearing in the mid-20th century, even early. Olivier lived a long life. He composed and he taught and he explored new sounds well into his later years. And then at the age of 83, he passed away in Paris in 1992, very peacefully. Olivier Messiaen did not just write and compose music, he created worlds where sound becomes color and rhythm becomes eternity, where birds sing and the voice of something greater can be heard. His music is very different than everything before it. So go and explore, go and listen to something or many things by Olivier Messiaen.